Hello and welcome to episode lucky number 13 of the A-Plus Show. My name is Michael Appel.
It's my lucky number, has been for a long, long time, Michael. I'm Alec Hogg.
This is a 30-minute show where Alec's going to, that damn frog, is going to give us the best from business news, investments from the week. I'll cover the politics and general news arena. Alec, how have things been looking? I had a look at the Daily Insider and it was the market report was green.
It's been a smashing week. In fact, it was a smashing session yesterday. And we are heading into the end of July, the best month for shares in many, many months. We've had a pretty rough 2 years, but it now appears as though the end is in sight. It hasn't come yet, but the end of the current depressing cycle of rising interest rates and falling share prices. The analysts are now looking ahead to interest rate cuts from around the middle of next year. So although they know there are going to be further increases in the next few months, the stock market always looks 18 months ahead. And what's been happening is because of higher interest rates around the world, people have been putting money into the US dollar, and that's affected things like the South African rand. And we saw the rand blowing out to 17.20, 17.25 against the US dollar at one stage. Today, it's back to 16.60. So there's been a big reversal. Reason, interest rates will continue to rise in America, but not for very much longer. And that's really the big story of the week. So investors are feeling more comfortable, and certainly people who are invested in South Africa can maybe take a deeper breath after this incredibly difficult period for the rand over the past few weeks.
A good news coming for motorists. I see yesterday a combination of the rand dollar strength and the oil price. We may be looking at a plus 1 rand over that reduction in the fuel price. That a lot of motorists will be happy about that.
Well, that's good news because the Brent crude oil price is bouncing all over the place. One day it'll be at $102 a barrel. Next day, like today, it's $107 a barrel. But the thing we got to watch most closely is the rand and how the rand is operating. My 3 stories today for this A-Plus are all upbeat. All good news stories, it's been a while since I've been able to provide smiley news. Yours, Mike?
I will be looking at President Ramaphosa's power reform agenda, what he plans to get us out of the load-shedding quagmire we've been in for 15 years. It couldn't have come soon enough, but it's been broadly welcomed. We'll look at that. We'll look at the KwaZulu-Natal conference of the ANC, what that spells for the president or for the liberation movement itself, and then a look at oil itself and the recent announcement by Minister Mantashe. It was gazetted that they're going to deregulate the price of 93 octane, going to put a price cap in. We'll discuss that.
Okay. Well, what are you kicking us off with this week?
Let's take a look at this widely welcomed announcement by the president. I know there are skeptics about what the president said, but I spoke to the head of the Solidarity Research Institute, Connie Mulder, and Alec, people can go back and watch the show from 2 weeks ago where we discussed the interventions that the SRI and Connie Mulder were speaking about. Liberalizing, getting the private sector in, getting rooftop solar in with a handsome feed-in tariff. And I said to Connie Mulder, jeepers, was the president listening into that interview? Because he said, I asked him, were you guys consulted on, because the president, as he does, consulted widely. It took him 10 days to come up with his plan, and he consulted widely. And he said, no, we as the Solidarity Research Institute weren't consulted. But it is amazing how 90% of what is contained in the president's plan comes directly from their research and from their reports. So that was interesting. I asked Connie Mulder, should South Africans celebrate this? He says we must be cautiously optimistic, and that coming from the SRI means it's a pretty good thing. Here's Connie Mulder.
All of this will be run out of the presidency, which is basically President Ramaphosa completely superseding his own minister, Minister Mantashe, and realizing that the reason this has not been happening is because everything gets stuck at DMRE, at the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. And this being run out of the presidency is basically admitting the previous errors and trying to reduce red tape as much as possible. Now, this is good. We would still like this to only be an online registration portal. I don't think NERSA is in a position to do that yet, but we'll keep on applying the pressure. For now, if you're an ordinary South African, the number one thing you can do is you can seriously start considering getting solar the moment those feed-in tariffs are published.
You might recall the discussion I had with Jordan Hill-Lewis, the mayor of Cape Town. And it was almost like he had some advance warning, because he said the door's opened a crack and I've kicked it open. But no politician kicks things open if they're going to get embarrassed later.
Yes.
And yet everything that he announced for the city of Cape Town, particularly this feeding back into the grid, was confirmed by the president. So
yes,
yeah, that's a reason for very good news. Pretty much everyone I've spoken to has supported it and said it's good timing. However, Frans Cronje, who we're going to hear from in just a moment, said, but what did he actually announce? And I said, he said that we can put my solar at home, which cost me so much money just so that I had it. I could continue working when there was load shedding. I can now sell it back into the grid. He said, yeah, that's fine, but that's not going to make the difference that's needed. We need 20,000 megawatts, and not the little bit that'll come from solar or from businesses feeding in. We need a plan. We need much more than this. So there are skeptics, but to me, it's almost like, from a philosophical point of view, it's almost like the central command and control economy approach or thought or thinking or belief of the ANC is no longer in vogue.
I would agree with you there, certainly. One thing Connie Mulder picked up there, and Outa has picked up on it as well, is the creation of this national energy crisis with consolidated and centralized within the presidency. That is the only critique that has come from the market and from several pundits out there, to say, just as when we had problems with the State Security Agency and the intelligence, what did the president do? He consolidated it within the presidency. So there much can be said for this national energy crisis, which floats in the ether. It's not accountable to Parliament. And that's where political parties are saying, if it was a function of it, if it was a department, we could summon them to a portfolio committee. We can't summon this crisis committee. It's similar to the coronavirus command council that sort of was there but wasn't established as a matter of legislation or anything, so can't be held accountable. That's the only critique.
It's a very good point. I recall getting terribly excited when Pravin Gordhan said that he would be getting government procurement when he was finance minister under one roof. And Kenneth Brown was appointed as our procurement czar. And it was actually even written in the budget that they would cut out 25 billion rand a year in costs by bringing everything together. And a very wise person said to me, okay, well, Pravin's there, but what happens if somebody who's not as socially minded as he were to take that role? Then you can plunder at will, because you've got everything centralized. So it's like our presidency, our laws for our presidency were written for Mandela. Not for Zuma.
So I suppose create a framework with the worst person in mind. I suppose that's the lesson there.
It's in South Africa. My goodness, you've had enough examples of why that should be taken into account.
Indeed. Alec, Frans Cronje, I've spoken to him a couple of times over the years.
Oh, you got similar hairstyles, I see, the two of you.
Yes, blessed, and blessed. Frans Cronje, I thought it was a fantastic interview. I loved hearing his insight.
He's an extraordinary human being. He has really been the arch bear in South Africa for 15 years. I can remember having conversations with him and thinking, no, this guy's over the top. And yet, what he was predicting and what he was forecasting and what he was warning against always seemed to come true, and in certain cases, even worse. So when you get somebody who's from that side, from that camp, who's now suddenly very excited and very optimistic about the future, it's really well worth listening to them. He hasn't changed the way he goes about things. He's using exactly the same process. He talks a lot and often to voters, primarily ANC voters, and he has reached the conclusion that we are headed for a coalition government in 2024. I put to him something we spoke about the other day, a good ANC and the bad ANC. He said, no, well, the voters believe it. So I'm as one with the voters. Not everybody else agrees, as we know, but he also says that the ANC voters are concerned about what the opposition parties are at, why they're squabbling all the time, because it's almost like in their minds, well, if we get rid of these guys, we're going to bring in people who are better, and they admit the DA is much better at governing and managing. You don't have to be a genius to work that one out. He says the ANC voters are not voting cattle, as Malema calls them. They are smart, they understand, and they have continuously over the years managed to bail us out. Well, South African public has bailed us out when we've got to those watershed points. But in the little clip that I'm very interested in getting your views on as well, he reckons that he was, when I spoke to him a year ago, I was very surprised because it was just after the KZN riots, and he was optimistic about the future. He was talking about things like the phoenix is going to rise out of these ashes. So I asked him, well, how about today? And here's what he had to say.
When I spoke to you a year ago, more upbeat on where things are going, the same methodology that made us get those calls right a decade ago, 15 years ago, same methodology in place today. And I think we are actually looking pretty good. We are near the point potentially of a transition of significance comparable to that of what we went through in the 1980s and the 1990s. I could make for you today a very sound case that South Africa's prospects are looking up.
And he made that case. He made a very sound case indeed. And it's to the optimistic side of our nature. Nobody wants to be a pessimist. And certainly those of us who live in this country and have options, because when you're skilled, you have options, are here because we think we can make a difference, because we think that there is an upside. And France really confirmed that. It was a big stamp of approval. But where are you sitting on this subject, Mike?
I listened with a lot of interest to his notion that for the ANC to win, it needs to discredit coalitions. And the coalition parties themselves are doing a pretty good job of that at the moment. As he said, there's squabbling, there's infighting. The voting public is going to sit back and go, okay, is this supposed to be the alternative to the ANC? But the greatest threat, as he puts it, is a well-established, squeaky clean and functioning coalition government that doesn't involve the ANC, that can be a real alternative. And Alec, I wish I had my phone on me because I plan to read out something from the ANC's policy documents. It's the National Policy Conference of the ANC at the moment. I see there were protesters outside, ANC staffers who haven't been paid. So you have a very lavish affair where I think thousands of people are being wined and dined at the ANC's expense. And then you have staffers outside holding up signs saying we need to be paid. And Paul Mashatile, the treasurer, is saying, no, we've made payment plans. Obviously, it's incredibly embarrassing for them, but it's just a sign of the times.
But who's paying for the conference then? Would this be the 500 industrialists who've been carefully selected for taxpayer funding?
Very interesting comments coming from Paul Mashatile and from Pule Mabe, who's the national spokesperson. He said it's incredibly expensive to run the ANC. And he said that the Political Party Funding Act that forces political parties to disclose their funders, he says, has been terrible for us. It's really shut us down. Nobody wants to associate with us anymore because you have things like the Zondo Commission and various commissions and just the corruption allegations against the ANC. People are not willing to put their money there. Although I will tell you, Alec, African Rainbow Minerals. I was looking at the IEC's website and I came across African Rainbow Minerals sponsoring a certain amount of money to the EFF. And I went, "Wow, that's Patrice Motsepe. This is a big story." And then I looked further, and they sponsor the ANC, the DA, the Freedom Front Plus, the ACDP, the IFP. So there are certain organizations that are giving a percentage to each party based on their size. And there are businesses out there, so there's still funding coming in.
In a different life, we're going back more than 20 years. I left journalism for a brief period to run group communications at ABSA. And part of my portfolio was government relations. And part of that portfolio was helping to fund democracy as we saw it.
Yeah.
And it was exactly the same at ABSA, and I'm sure it is the same today, that we gave a certain amount allocated, and it was broken down by the proportion that each party had of the vote, the national vote.
Yeah.
So back then, the ANC would have got 67%, the DA 3%, and so on. The National Party would have got some. So you are going back a long time. But that's the way that corporates look at it. And they say, we do want to fund democracy, we do want to help political parties, but we don't want to be accused of favoring one over the other. And you can imagine a guy like Patrice Motsepe, who's Cyril's brother-in-law.
Yeah.
There's no way he's going to risk any kind of criticism for being unfair. So, he even gives to the EFF. And I can assure you that ABSA probably even gives to the EFF today. Had I still been there, that's what the policy was, and I'm sure that would still be the one. But let's get back to that coalition story.
That excerpt, and I wish I could read it. It basically says the ANC is discussing as a policy the fact that coalitions need to be discredited because of the fact, and this is, I hope I can quote this correctly, the coalitions have shown that their only reason for existence is to destroy the ANC, and they have about as much in common as a bunch of drunkards in a beer hall. This is in an official ANC document. And it went out on social media saying, guys, what do you think of this? They are seriously looking to attack the legitimacy and credibility of coalitions leading up to 2024.
And that's exactly what Frans said yesterday.
Yes.
That's their lifeline, but it isn't a lifeline.
Yeah.
It's almost like they hope, I suppose, when you are surrounded and before you finally give up, you throw a Hail Mary pass here or there, and the best way to do it is to discredit those who are attacking you.
Yeah.
But there's a big message in what Frans said, and in that, for the opposition parties. A huge dose of humility is required.
Yeah.
Don't let voters think that you, just like the ANC, you're going to get power and then you're going to abuse the voters and come back in 5 years' time. Actually make things happen. And I'm seeing, it's a little party, the Patriotic Alliance. I was a little bit dubious about it to begin with, Gayton McKenzie. But I'm watching what he's doing in Central Karoo, Mike. It's interesting. He's gone in there. Here's the leader of the party. It's the one area where the Patriotic Alliance does have the mayorship. Nobody else wanted it. And he's made some enormous changes already. And you get the same with Chris Pappas in Mgeni in KZN. And there are other examples as well around the country. That's the kind of politician who is going to pull the opposition over the line in 2024. And you need to see that happening more and more, where the individuals who are going to be voting these people into power do see a reason for getting rid of this corrupt bunch and bringing in people who do really have the case. So let the ANC continue with its attacking of coalitions, because it might make the coalitions start growing up a little.
Yeah. Frans Cronje's message to the smaller parties, that if you band together, you can be bigger than the ANC, but get your house in order, stop the squabbling. And that dovetails nicely into my next story, which was with Dr. Ralph Mathekga, a political analyst, and we were discussing the KZN conference, the ANC's KZN conference, and how Cyril Ramaphosa's so-called slate, the Ankole slate, lost to the Taliban slate. And Ralph had...
Where did they come with it, Taliban?
Well,
what's the thinking behind calling themselves that?
Our colleague Courtney is going to be putting a video out about that. A reporter from The Witness in KZN actually interviewed a gentleman from the Taliban slate to ask him where this name comes from. So I don't want to let that cat out the bag, but it's basically romanticizing what the Taliban stands for and how they overcame the imperialist US. So read from that what you will in a democratic South Africa. We have a faction of the biggest grouping of the ANC romanticizing the Taliban.
And they pro-Zuma, those guys.
These guys are pro anybody that's anti-Cyril. Well, pro anybody that is against Cyril. In this case, Drs. William Kize, 9 out of the 11 regions of KZN have said we are endorsing him to stand against Cyril come the December elective conference. But yes, they are largely seen as part of the radical economic transformation slate or grouping.
My insiders are telling me that the ANC will disintegrate after the elective conference.
We shall hold you to that, Mr. Hogg.
Here's my insiders are telling me that.
Here's Ralph Mathekga.
It's no longer about President Ramaphosa. I think the party is forming beyond Ramaphosa. And the big message from this KZN provincial conference that has just taken place is that there is just no compromise. The party, the NC, will most likely look very differently after President Ramaphosa. It looks quite dicey for him going into an elective conference on the back foot like this. But it's not unexpected. It's not surprising. It will always shock when it comes to expression. But no doubt it has been coming that the KZN is a big block that is always going to be a problem for President Ramaphosa because of the legacy of President Jacob Zuma.
So this idea of unity, renewal that Ramaphosa has been driving since he came into office, and especially since he's been under the hammer for dealing with those within his party who are implicated in all sorts of wrongdoing, that idea that they could bring an ANC together that looks different, is renewed, inspires hope. That is what Ralph Mathekga says. There is no compromise on what the ANC wants to be post-Ramaphosa. And the KZN conference voting the way it did says they're not interested in Ramaphosa and his reform agenda. They're not interested in those who are implicated, like in murder and corruption allegations. Do the decent, ethical, moral thing and at least step aside. They want to get rid of the step aside rule within the ANC. It blows your mind.
I haven't done enough research on it yet, but I was pointed towards something interesting that's happening in by-elections. We get the information all the time from the IEC. And in many of the instances where there are by-elections, the reason for them is that the incumbent has been assassinated.
Yeah.
So it continues to be a blight on our democratic system. But getting back to what Ralph was saying, and that was also a very insightful interview. Imagine if you are Maria Ramos, who spent a decade, and the whole Andrew Donaldson, the team around her at Treasury, who did fantastic work. And this was something that Frans Cronje picked up on. He said, the first 10 to 12 years of the South African democracy were exemplary. Imagine you those people. You're still the ANC. You're still part of the party. And you look at where the party is today. Isn't there a comeback opportunity? I think of Phumzile, for instance, who's now just come back to the country. Phumzile.
She was at Mlambo.
She was now in the top 5 at the UN.
UN, yes.
Big job.
Yeah.
She did another doctorate there while she was there. So she's just come back to South Africa. She's a politician. What is she thinking about doing in the 2024 election? No. Certainly not standing alongside Ace Magashule or the guys from KZN. So there is so many moving parts in all of this. The opposition parties, as they stand right now, have got all the trump cards. But as we've mentioned earlier, they look to be throwing them away with their internal squabbling. So if they want a chance to take this country in a new direction before the ANC does rejuvenate itself in whatever shape or form, they better start moving now. We need to keep a close eye on that.
Your next interview, Alec, I listened with fascination because I look at the stats that come out of Treasury, that come out of Stats SA, that reports the unemployment figure. And what I think we should start doing is referring to those formerly employed in the formal sector, that unemployment figure, because that leads us into our next interview, a man who has a completely different view on it.
Yeah, GG Alcock has, I've had the privilege of getting to know him over the years. He grew up in a mud hut in Msinga to activist parents who felt that that was the way for the new South Africa. So he spoke Zulu long before he spoke English, and he had Zulu friends long before he had any white friends. And he's focused his life on understanding what is going on in the informal sector. And he really is an outlier who should be listened to a lot more. Just a small point on this. If we were Nigeria, if we used our figures in the way that Nigeria, if Nigeria used their figures in the way that we use ours, they would be a fraction of the size of the South African economy, not the same or even bigger than this economy, because Nigeria is 95% informal economy. South Africa uses a really small percentage as the informal economy. And as we'll hear in this clip, that hugely underestimates what's going on.
I've said around 12% real unemployment. And if you want to take the figures of, say, 40% that are touted around, you've got to place the word formal unemployment in front of that word, because that reflects to people who have a pay slip and earn a salary or a wage. If you look outside of that, if you look at this massive informal economy, the spaza sector is a 150 billion rand sector, fast food is a 90 billion rand a year sector, the taxi industry is a 50 billion rand a year sector, traditional herbal medicines are 18 billion rand sector, hair salons a 10 billion rand sector. None of them have pay slips.
And he goes on and on about the size of the informal economy. So I liked what you said earlier, and that's what GG says. Call it formal unemployment.
Yeah.
But true unemployment is, it has to be, because if you've got all these huge sectors with big amounts of economic activity in them, how can you just ignore them in your numbers and indeed in your employment figures? But you've got a really good story to end us off with.
Yes, I spoke to Enrico Ganter, and he's a man who spent several decades with Sasol. And he's got a petrochemical engineering background. And I spoke to him and his colleague, Justice van der Spey. They are UK-based experts in the field of oil, gas, trading, futures. And it was just one small aspect. I mentioned the fact that we are deregulating the fuel price. Gwede Mantashe gazetted it. There's a 30-day public comment period. We're in that period at the moment. And he made an interesting point about what happened when they deregulated the fuel price in the UK. And there are unintended consequences. Here's Enrico Ganter.
In South Africa, gasoline will still flow as long as the cap is above the price. The moment the price goes over the cap, people will stop bringing gasoline in or producing it. So suddenly you have no fuel in the country because the cap won't allow you to import fuel. Nobody's going to import at a loss. Putting a cap in like that is just too simplistic. What happened in the UK is that the smaller companies, because they don't hedge, aren't able to manage the long-term supply around the price cap. And so the moment the market price exceeded the cap, they just went belly up.
So one hopes that there is a lot of thought that goes into this. It's not as simplistic as, we're going to introduce competition in the fuel industry. We'll put a cap in. The market's going to do what the market does. We cannot control international oil prices and what's going on in Ukraine and Russia.
That's a very, very good point. But a bigger one in the South African context, especially for a communist like Gwede Mantashe, is when you deregulate the fuel industry, you say goodbye petrol jockeys.
Yeah.
And there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of petrol pump attendants. In the UK, you pump your own petrol. It's the first thing that happens, is you get rid of the pump attendant. In South Africa, we have other priorities. So I agree with you. I'm not sure this thing has been properly thought through. I never knew the point that you made there, and it's that there would be a cap on it. This sounds quite ridiculous. But that means, sometimes when you have blackouts from Eskom, I'm sure you've sat there and said, I don't care what it costs. I need to get electricity now to do the work that I'm trying to do for some person, perhaps in an international market. So you're not as price sensitive in those circumstances. When it comes to South Africa, we subsidize the motor industry massively in this country. We pay here a substantial premium for our motor vehicles because there's a 30% import surcharge that subsidizes the exports that go out of South Africa to other parts of the world. Now, you can argue this as you like. The fact is the motor industry employs a heck of a lot of people. The petrol pumps, the petrol jockeys, have got a lot of people around them. So before you decide to terminate or to change something as radically as is being suggested, just realize the social consequences. And sometimes in South Africa, as much as I hate subsidies, sometimes the state that you're at in the economic cycle would suggest that those subsidies are fulfilling a very useful social purpose. Rather, what do? Get rid of all the petrol jockeys and then bring in a basic income grant to make up for it? Unintended consequences. These are complex issues that need to be well thought through. And with respect, I'm not sure Gwede Mantashe is the guy to think them through.
Well, you can expect that their alliance partners, COSATU especially, are going to be fighting like hell to stop anything that's going to cause a change in the labor market in respect of, as you say, these petrol jockeys.
Well, for sure. Yeah. And so they should.
Yeah.
Because these are the people who, they make South Africa different. One of the things about our country that I love is that I can get a smile by smiling at somebody. You walk down the street, you go to the garage, wherever you are, if you make eye contact and smile in South Africa, you get a beam.
Yeah.
And you get shining eyes. That's not the case all over the world, and I've traveled a lot.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. My brother, I won't say which part of the world he's in. I don't want to alienate that country, but he said there's just a connection. You can strike up conversations here, and people are not going to alienate you with anybody in the street, and people will talk to you. It's not the case all around the world.
And they even laugh at my jokes, which just random strangers. We sometimes underestimate the value of that human contact, that Ubuntu, which has been got such a bad press in South Africa from certain quarters. But actually, it's part of our humanity. So I really don't mind paying a little bit extra at the pump, personally, if I'm going to be able to have the interaction that I do have with people who otherwise would be unemployed. And if you really want to start unpacking the subsidies, perhaps the place to start is on the fuel taxes, which are massive and growing.
Yeah.
It's a lovely slush fund for government to dip their fingers into when they're inefficient in other areas.
Yeah.
So maybe there's a heck of a lot of other low-hanging fruit before you start tampering with employment, which I hear what GG says, but you still need that formal employment, and the formal employment situation is not looking good.
Yeah. Well, Alec, we are going to be in trouble with our colleagues. We have gone beyond the buzzer, but thank you for staying with us for the last 33 minutes. Appreciate that. We'll see you next week.
Cheerio.